Welcome to the Workplace Well-being Essential Series. I'm Mari Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of Advancing Wellness. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this expert interview where we explore topics that impact employee well-being. My guest today is Jessica Grossmeier. Jessica is the author of Reimagining Workplace Well-being, Fostering a Culture of Purpose, Connection, and Transcendence. And she is a leading voice in workplace well-being, having dedicated her career to identifying evidence-based strategies that promote a thriving workforce. Her work includes conducting collaborative research, advising, writing, and speaking on topics related to strategic planning, topics related to workplace well-being best practices, measurement and evaluation, strategic planning, and value demonstration. Jessica has published more than 80 articles in professional journals and served as a co-editor of the Art of Health Promotion section of the American Journal of Health Promotion. Jessica, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here for this conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Mari.
Well, today we're going to explore this topic of workplace well-being from a little bit different perspective. We're going to learn from Jessica about her suggestions for reimagining workplace well-being. So is it time to make some changes and look at some things differently? So I'm curious, how did you come to write a book about reimagining workplace well-being?
Well, Mari, you know that most of my career has been devoted to outcomes research, identifying best practice approaches to well-being. And we've known for some time that spirituality is a key domain in a holistic approach to well-being. In fact, back in the 70s, when the National Wellness Institute first published their model, spiritual well-being was part of it, and they defined that. And I've been interested in the area for a long time, but I've noticed that employers are reluctant to address well-being. There are some exceptions, but I've noticed that a lot are very reluctant to mention it in their models. And so this past year, I was on sabbatical. That was a sabbatical that I knew I was taking for many years. I'd been preparing for it. And I went into the year wanting to just follow the breadcrumbs of my curiosity. And back in 2019, I had done a special issue in the Art of Health Promotion section of AJHP, and it was on spiritual well-being. And one day I just sat down at my computer and I started to search the databases to see if anything new had come up since I had read that. And it turns out that when I first did that issue back in 2019, I had been using the wrong search terms to uncover the research that I stumbled upon. This was probably in February or March of last year. And all of a sudden, decades and decades and decades of research came up in the area called workplace spirituality. And so I decided to just keep looking as long as my curiosity kept leading me, and it did. And I wanted to see, especially, what did the research have to say about the most effective ways to address spiritual well-being and to understand how employers have been addressing this component.
So interesting that I view you as one of the top researchers in our field, and for you to discover that just changing the search terms would change so dramatically, I think that's just comical. So that's such an interesting revelation. So thank you for sharing that. Can happen to all of us.
Yep.
In your book, you suggest that one of the missing elements to workplace well-being is this idea of this focus on spirituality. And many people equate, and I think myself included in some ways, equate spirituality with religion, which is a topic that is often not even discussed in the workplace. It's like politics and religion. You just don't go there at work. So can you explain what you mean by workplace spirituality?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I discovered is that there is no single consensus definition of spirituality or one agreed upon way to measure it. And when you look across the many definitions that are out there and the measurement tools that are being used in the research, three elements consistently come up. And so that became the focus of my book. I'm like, well, everyone can agree on these three elements. So let's begin here. And I don't put a definition necessarily in my book. I share other people's definitions. But the three elements that I focus on are having a sense of meaning and connection in one's life and in one's work, having a sense of connection and belonging with others, which includes coworkers, and having a sense of connection to something bigger than yourself, which is what I call transcendence in my book. And, when it comes to religion, I'm so glad that you brought that up, Mari, because if you ask people what provides meaning in their life and where they get their sense of identity, where they find community, many of them are going to refer to an affiliation with a faith community. So religion is highly related to spirituality, but it is different. I believe that spirituality is a much broader concept. It is inclusive of religion, but it is much broader than that. And so if workplaces can come forward with a new way of talking about this, then I think then we can start to talk about this in a different way. And, when I've looked at definitions of religion, it's really a set of beliefs and practices that express what we believe about our connection with some source of the divine. Spirituality, as I said, does include that, but it is possible to be a spiritual person without having a specific religious affiliation. And it is possible and quite common for people to say that they are spiritual, but not religious. And so that really piqued my attention. I said, hey, we can talk about this.
Right. And I would agree with that. I would describe myself as being spiritual, but not at all religious. So I completely identify with that. You mentioned as this third element, transcendence. Can you talk a little bit more about that and explain what you really mean by that?
Yeah, I think the transcendence piece is missing from a lot of conversations in the workplace today. We're hearing a lot about how we need to take a more humanistic approach, a more holistic approach, a more whole person approach to well-being. And as I look at, okay, well, what do they mean by that? They're talking a lot about meaning and purpose and connection with others. No one's mentioning transcendence. And so I'm so glad that we get to talk about it here because a lot of people haven't wanted to talk about that. So when you look at what the word transcendence means, it means going beyond ordinary limitations to reach the condition of moving beyond our physical needs and realities. And this is a researched term. There are these states called self-transcendent mental states. And some people think of this as a sense of higher consciousness, an elevated state of consciousness. And when the research talks about self-transcendence mental states, they're talking about awe, beauty, flow, inspiration, joy, and wonder. And these are experiences that add magic to our everyday lives. They're not something that happens every single day all the time. And if you chase after transcendence, you often won't find it. It needs to surface. But there are many ways that organizations can create workplace experiences that make these self-transcendent mental states more likely. And I could go into some of those if you want to just ground this a little bit away from the conceptual.
Yeah, that would be great. I think it being a little more concrete is always good.
Yeah, I think so too. So mindfulness is one of the most common ways that organizations foster transcendence at work. And when I looked into the research for the Transcendence chapter, I was blown away by how much mindfulness research there is. And it's no surprise to me why so many organizations now have entire movements around mindfulness in their organizations. So it sometimes functions as a program, but for many, it is becoming embedded into the culture of the organization. This means embedding mindful pauses into every meeting, limiting the length of meetings to allow a cushion of 10 or 15 minutes in between. So if somebody has back-to-back meetings, there's that natural pause because meetings are limited to 45 minutes or 50 minutes, for example. And it gives people that space, especially if they've been trying to practice mindfulness. We hear stop and take 3 deep breaths. Well, when do people have time to do that? When they're racing from thing to thing to thing, right? So organizations are starting to build these buffers, these natural buffers in, and to help leaders and individuals to become more aware. Multitasking is actually the death of us. It's the death of productivity. We need to start monotasking more. So building a culture of monotasking where the expectation is you will not be referring to your phone or your laptop during a meeting. Someone else can take notes. There's a designated note taker. You are here to tune in and listen and to be paying attention to what others are saying. And so that's a big way. Nature is another very common way that people experience transcendence. And there's been a lot of work done on how to incorporate nature into building design. So we're seeing more use of natural light and living plants. And in the latest Google building that I had a chance to tour recently, they're circulating fresh, clean air into the building. Mm-hmm. So they're bringing the outside in. We've had organizations create outdoor spaces for people to meet or go for walks or create walking meetings. So that's not new. Mindful organizations encourage people to take breaks during the workday and to make those mindful walks, not just the walking meeting. And that's something that as I was going on my sabbatical, I started to incorporate some of these practices into my day. I was trying to be a good boss to myself as I was doing sabbatical. And so I said, I'm going to take this walk every day in the middle of the day, and I'm going to actually make it a mindful walk and focus on what I'm seeing around me, what am I smelling, engaging all my senses. And it's about a 45-minute loop that I do. So it's quite a long walk. And when I come back, my mind is utterly transformed. I have this equanimous mind, which is what we study in yoga. So I think it can really elevate our consciousness in a new way when we do these things. There's also a lot of research on the self-transcendent state of flow. And so when we think of flow, oftentimes we think about athletic performance, but it's when we become so deeply immersed in what we're doing that we lose track of time and space. And when you have a chance to really immerse yourself in something and you're enjoying it, there's nothing like that. It's so satisfying. Yeah. And it can be 10 minutes, it can be hours. Organizations can make flow experiences more likely by creating these cultures of monotasking that I talked about, where employees are discouraged from multitasking. And they're doing this in a lot of different ways with technology, with policies, just with good old fashioned norms and practices. So flow is, I think, another important way, especially for high performing organizations. They are always looking for, how do we become more innovative and creative? And transcendence is a way to get there. The last one I want to talk about are celebrations and rituals. And I think we used to be better at this decades ago than we are now. I don't see as many celebrations or rituals in the workplace. And, they can be used to recognize beginnings, endings, milestones, and celebrations. They can honor things that are going away. They can welcome new things in. And there are several types of rituals in the workplace spirituality research, which I do discuss in my book. And this includes having rituals around, like I said, welcoming new people in. It could be onboarding rituals. This is what happens every single time we have a new employee come in. This is how they're introduced to our organization and to our teams. And not just, here's the checklist, get your laptop, get your email signature, but rituals like you're now part of us. Let's welcome you in. There are layoff rituals. A lot of times organizations are using these very dehumanizing processes to let people go. We can acknowledge that somebody's going away, but honor and respect what they have brought to an organization. And then there are silence rituals. And I think we've seen more organizations. I know Eileen Fisher, they begin their meetings with a moment of silence just to let people ground themselves in their chairs. So I could go into a lot more, but those are a few of the big ways that I talk about in the book.
Well, I love hearing those concrete examples because I think that really helps ground it for us. And I really appreciate the idea that organizations are consciously working to be able to set these, in some cases, boundaries, such as the meeting times and the giving permission, if you will, for taking in nature and taking breaks. I mean, how many times I've done research when developing strategies with clients, and I ask questions of the workforce to get a sense of what the culture is like and what the work pace is like. And I'll ask things like, what do you do on your lunch hour? And how often do you take breaks? And, the responses you get back are, I eat lunch alone at my desk and we don't take breaks in this organization. And right away that, you can't just keep going and not stop. People have to take breaks. So it's so interesting to see that organizations are really being thoughtful about these kinds of topics.
Some organizations, not all of them. We have a long way to go.
I know we do have a long way to go. Yeah. So what role can or should spirituality play in workplace well-being?
Well, I've thought about that a lot as I was writing the book. And as I said earlier, there has been a lot of talk about how we need to welcome the whole person approach into the workplace. And that's because there is research that shows that when employees are able to express their true selves at work, it's linked to higher employee engagement levels and job satisfaction and enjoyment of their work. So there is a reason why organizations want to do this. And when I think about a whole person approach, it means creating space for every individual to contribute and be valued for who they are, as they are, with their unique perspective and experience. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives recognize this whole person approach includes gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and now cognitive, age, social, and cultural diversity. Spirituality includes people's deepest beliefs about who they are, what matters most to them, and how they view themselves in connection with the universe and with the world around them. So my question has been, why would we not also include spiritual diverse views as part of our DEI and well-being efforts? It's such a crucial part. It's the seat of who we are. Why would we not try to find a way? And I think with DEI initiatives, we have found ways to talk about extremely sensitive topics these past 2 years. We've been talking about very sensitive things. You said we don't talk about religion and politics. Well, people are talking politics, right?
Yeah.
And so why can't we take some of those lessons that we've learned about how to create boundaries and shared values of respect and bring that into how we talk to one another around this area as well? And I think it is possible to do this. And many organizations are demonstrating that they can do this. They're doing it.
Well, that's encouraging to hear that organizations really are working in this direction. And I hope that we see many more continue to do that. In your book, you've described your personal journey from burnout to thriving. What are some of the ways that employers can help address the challenges that employees are facing around burnout, disengagement, and lack of professional fulfillment?
Yeah, I opened the book with my personal story of burnout. And for myself, my spiritual well-being journey was part of working my way back through, because for me, I had lost sight of my purpose and what I was doing it for. I've always been very passionate about well-being. I still am. But there was a time in my career where I was really struggling to find the everyday meaning in what I was doing. And so for me, it really began with getting back in touch with my purpose again and with my values, and starting to take a really hard look at, was I living out the values that I said were my highest priority? When I think about how I want people to characterize me and how I want to be remembered in my life, and how that translates into behaviors, I was not exhibiting those behaviors in the workplace. And so I went on a bit of a journey myself to rediscover and name for myself, what is my purpose? What are my values? What does it look like to live that out every single day, no matter what I'm doing for my job? And when it comes to burnout, I think it's a piece of it. It's certainly not all of it. One of the books that I read last year is by Jennifer Moss. She wrote The Burnout Epidemic. And she states that organizations have to use more systemic approaches to address burnout. So my journey was very individual, and my workplace didn't really come alongside and say, well, here's some tools that can help you. And if they had, it would have been programs, and it would have been, here's the EAP, right? So one of the things that I've really been thinking about is, how can organizations create systems that better support people? And I was thinking about this when I read Gallup's 2022 State of the Workplace report, which just came out, I believe, last week. And they found that stress levels are at an all-time high globally. Actually, in the US, we're doing better than a lot of countries, which was a surprise to me. So, I was thinking about, what can organizations do about this? And many people have talked about how the length of the average day just got a lot longer during the pandemic. And it hasn't abated. People are still working really, really long days. The traditional commute from work to home has now been replaced by meetings for many people. My husband is with a multinational employer, and he's starting his day now at 6 a.m. It used to be he was catching the bus Now it's on Zoom calls at 6 a.m. and they go well into the evening hours many days. And he's not alone. A lot of people I know are doing these kinds of hours. And so we have to, as a workplace, address this need for boundaries. And when you've got your boss's boss demanding that you get on calls at 6 a.m, it's extremely hard to set boundaries for yourself.
Yeah.
I think it takes a certain level of confidence. It takes a certain level of having that autonomy in your job and that environment that respects that. Many employees don't have that. And so to throw another resilience program at them is really a slap in the face for a lot of employees. So I don't have all the answers when it comes to how do we address burnout, but I think we have to be looking at policies, practices, and guidance around how workers treat one another, and especially leaders. How do leaders treat one another, because they're role modeling what's acceptable? And how do leaders interact with employees? We know from a lot of research, including this latest Gallup report, that people tend to leave bad relationships in organizations, bad relationships with their boss. If there's toxic relationships with their coworkers, that's what oftentimes they're leaving. They'll go to another workplace environment that has a lot of the same demands, but doesn't have that toxic culture. And so there's a need for a return to the so-called soft skills of learning better active listening skills, expressing compassion and kindness towards one another, and treating one another with the respect that we deserve. And so I think employers can do a lot of things as part of whatever training they're offering in the workplace, whether it is workplace well-being training, I think there's a fit here, or it can be in leadership development and organizational effectiveness, talent management types of training. We can be embedding this stuff all over the place and starting to reinforce it really matters how we treat one another. And it matters for well-being as well as for business performance.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think there's a lot of opportunities to integrate well-being with, L&D and leadership development and training and development and all those areas. DEI, I think there's got to be some collaboration and cross-team pollination really within those functions. I think that's something that's really missing.
I really agree. And we've been talking about the need to integrate across functions in well-being for a really long time. I remember, reading about this way at the start of my career. There were thought leaders talking about the need to do this. It's hard. And I think one of the things that has given me some hope that we're making a change is we are now beginning to bring in at the C-suite level strategic roles with budget, with authority to bring these functions together. And sometimes it's called a chief well-being officer role. They're calling it chief people officer role. They're calling it a lot of different things. But anybody that's elevated to that level with the authority, the budget, the oversight of these different functions, then they can say, okay, here's a strategic business objective.
Right.
And this is how we're going to advance employee engagement, employee experience, employee well-being across all these functions. Then everybody needs to be aligned. I think that's going to help us move forward.
Totally agree. And let's go to that thought around this strategic viewpoint, because in your book, you advocate for the development of strategic plan. But I've noticed that with research that I've been reading, for example, Willis Towers Watson survey showed that 72% of employers are seeking to differentiate and customize their well-being programs in order to be able to attract talent. And yet only 44% don't have a health and well-being strategy. From your perspective, what do you think? Why do you think so few organizations fail to develop a strategic plan for well-being?
So this is just my speculation. I think one big reason for a lack of strategic plans is that organizations haven't positioned well-being strategically within their organizations. It's tacked onto the tactical responsibilities of someone in a managerial HR or benefits role. And the creation of a strategic plans requires strategic thinking. And that's a skill set that if you're just putting out fires every day and reacting to what's coming at you, you don't have the ability to think strategically. It requires a different, I actually think of it as a transcendent state. We need to elevate our state to be able to get up to the strategy level. And that also requires that we have somebody who understands all of the different functions in the organizations and how they can work together. Because if you're not really sure what it means to have responsibility or oversight for risk management, you're not going to be able to understand how to work with that function effectively. And so I think part of the creating a strategic plan requires putting people into more strategic positions in the organization, giving them the time, the space, and by the way, the mandate to create this,
and the resources.
Right. There was this wonderful interview that happened. It was the Global Wellness Institute's Workplace Well-being Initiative, and they had an interview of chief well-being officers. Mm-hmm. And for each one of the individuals, they said, it is a requirement that we think strategically at this level. And so that is part of their role and responsibilities. When you're tacking a job or responsibility onto somebody else's role, oftentimes without additional compensation or budget, that sends you a message that this isn't going to be strategic. And so we have to set our people up for success by bringing this up to the strategic level.
Well, I'm glad to hear that there are some places where it is being brought to a strategic level. And again, I know we have a lot more work, and you and I are on the mission to make sure that happens. But hopefully we'll see more organizations really taking this to that level where it really is viewed strategically.
Yeah. And can I add one more thing onto that, Mari? Sure. Because I don't want to give short shrift to the many HR managers and benefits managers who have exceptionally strong strategic plans. So it's not that it's impossible to do this. It does require time and investment of resources. It requires access to these cross-functional leaders and, the ability to mobilize them to pay attention to, hey, I'm creating a strategic plan. I think a lot of what we're doing can be aligned. And, I think the best strategic plans are informed by multiple sources of data. And oftentimes the HR or benefits manager only has access to certain kinds of data. And so they really do need these other functions to come together with them and help them understand, well, here's how the view of the organization looks from my seat based on the data that I have available to me. And I've seen organizations use strategic planning tools to really help them understand what the needs are across multiple functions, across multiple data points, and to also add to that data by getting employee input and feedback. And I know that you do that a lot in your work with focus groups and surveys and interviews. So I have seen organizations put a lot of effort into a thoughtful strategic plan. And it's interesting, the organizations that rely on grant funding, they're required to have a written strategic plan with measurable objectives. And many of these people don't have a ton of experience doing this, but there are so many free tools available that can help guide people in creating these things. It's a matter of making it a priority. And when people are using these grant sources as funding, there's a lot of incentive for them because if they've got a better strategic plan, they're more likely to get the funding they're seeking. So it's really a matter of making it a priority, I think.
Well, it is. And, we can only hope that organizations will continue to make well-being a priority, because we all know they can't achieve their business objectives without healthy, engaged people. So with that, Jessica, I'm curious as to where we might be able to find more for our audience about the work that you're doing if they want to follow up and learn more.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mari. So the book is available if anyone's interested in anywhere that books are sold online. So that includes Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and a lot of other places. I invite people to follow me on LinkedIn because I continue to follow the research that's emerging right now. And now that people know that this is an interest of mine, they're sending me research studies. And so I'm constantly posting on LinkedIn about the new resources that I'm coming across, new research, and I'm trying to break down some of the concepts into the book into more digestible pieces. So feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. And then I have a website, jessicagrossmeier.com, where people can get additional free resources, including some that I mentioned in my book. And then I'm going to be adding to those resources, especially around employer case examples, to help people see, well, what are organizations doing? What does this actually look like to address this area? So those are a couple places to start.
Excellent. Well, lots of great resources. And again, just your fabulous book about Reimagining Workplace Well-being. Jessica, as always, it's wonderful to spend time with you. Thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mari.